To the outside world, Christopher Watts looked like the man who had checked every box in the suburban dream. A freshly painted two-story home in a quiet neighborhood in Frederick, Colorado. A wife who radiated energy and optimism in every social media post. Two young daughters, Bella and Celeste, whose laughter spilled into every family video. And, in the summer of 2018, another reason to celebrate. A baby boy on the way. Shanann's Facebook feed was a gallery of perfection. Chris grilling burgers in the backyard, Chris assembling toys in the living room, Chris leaning down to kiss Shanann's growing belly. Friends scrolled through her posts and saw happiness. But perfection in photographs is a snapshot, not a full story. Behind those curated moments was a marriage under strain. Shanann, a health and wellness promoter, traveled frequently for work. She was organized, ambitious, and determined to keep the family's finances, schedules, and dreams in check. Chris, once engaged and affectionate, had grown increasingly distant. Friends noticed the shift. He had lost weight, started dressing differently, and carried himself with a new, almost self-conscious confidence. His phone, once left on counters and tables, was now an extension of his hand. Conversations between the couple grew shorter, less warm. To outsiders, the changes might have been dismissed as stress or fatigue. But to Shanann, something was wrong. That August, Shanann left for a business trip to Arizona. While away, she confided in friends about her fears. She suspected Chris was pulling away emotionally, maybe even involved with someone else. Still, she hoped that once she returned, they could talk, reconnect, and fix what had been unraveling. It was that mix of hope and unease that marked her final days. In the early morning hours of August 13th, 2018, Shanann returned home from her trip. A friend dropped her off just before 2 a.m. It was dark and quiet in the Watts household. What happened inside those walls over the next few hours would shatter the perfect image Chris had maintained for years. Later that day, Shanann missed a scheduled doctor's appointment for her pregnancy. A red flag to those who knew her well. Her phone went unanswered. Texts piled up without a response, and the worry began to spread. By early afternoon, her best friend Nicole was on the Watts' doorstep, knocking and calling out her name. Shanann's car was in the garage. Her purse, phone, and keys were inside. But Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were nowhere to be found. Nicole called the police for a welfare check. When officers arrived, Chris greeted them calmly, almost too calmly. He allowed them into the house, answering their questions with an even tone, suggesting maybe Shanann had gone to a friend's or taken the kids somewhere. Yet his demeanor seemed off. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, crossed and uncrossed his arms, and occasionally looked away mid-answer. For trained investigators, these weren't just nervous habits. They were possible indicators of stress and deception. As the officers moved through the home, they found no signs of a struggle. But the absence of Shanann's essentials, the phone, the car, the medication for her children, was troubling. Outside, a neighbor mentioned his security camera might have caught something unusual. In the footage, Chris could be seen early that morning backing his truck into the garage, something the neighbor said he had never done before. The neighbor noted Chris seemed different, fidgety, unlike his usual self. That first day, no one could prove anything, but the perfect family man standing in front of them didn't quite match the urgency of a husband and father whose family had vanished. And though Chris didn't yet know it, every word, every gesture, and every choice he made from that moment forward would be studied, analyzed, and eventually used against him. By the evening of August 13th, the story of the missing Watts family was spreading quickly through the small town of Frederick. Local reporters began making calls, and neighbors whispered theories across driveways. The picture-perfect Facebook posts from Shanann now sat in sharp contrast to the unsettling reality unfolding in real time. Chris agreed to speak with a local news crew. Standing on his front porch, dressed in a neatly pressed shirt and shorts, he addressed the camera with a calmness that many found unnerving. His arms were folded tightly across his chest, his weight shifted back on his heels, and his eyes darted to the side when certain questions were asked. "Shanann, Bella, Celeste, if you're out there, just come back," he said, his voice steady but strangely flat. It was the kind of plea that on the surface seemed genuine, but lacked the emotional cadence one might expect from a desperate father. Behavioral analysts watching the interview noticed several things. Chris rarely used his wife or daughter's names, preferring pronouns like they or them. This kind of distancing language is sometimes a subconscious way of emotionally separating oneself from the subject. His smile appeared fleeting and forced, often at moments when smiling was contextually inappropriate. His breathing patterns were inconsistent, with noticeable deep breaths following questions that probed his last interactions with Shanann. Behind the scenes, investigators were already mapping out their strategy. They had no direct evidence of foul play yet, but there were glaring inconsistencies between Chris's public demeanor and the urgency of the situation. The neighbors' surveillance footage showing Chris backing his truck into the garage loomed large in their minds. It was a rare, specific action that might indicate loading something or concealing an activity. The morning after the news interview, Chris voluntarily came to the police station. Detectives began their approach carefully. They didn't accuse him outright. Instead, they offered water, chatted casually, and let him settle into the interview room. Establishing a baseline for his normal speech patterns, gestures, and posture was essential before moving into more sensitive territory. Chris started by recounting the previous 48 hours. His timeline was crisp in some places, oddly vague in others. When speaking about the moment Shanann returned from her trip, he became noticeably less specific. He claimed they had a brief, emotional conversation about their marriage, and that she said she was taking the kids to a friend's house. But when pressed for the name of the friend, Chris hesitated, his gaze shifting to the wall. He eventually provided a name, but it was one that investigators had already confirmed had not seen Shanann that day. The detectives noted how Chris's body language changed during this part of the conversation. He leaned back, arms crossed, his voice quieter and slower. When certain questions landed, he scratched the back of his neck, a self-soothing gesture often linked to anxiety or discomfort. These subtle cues, while not proof of guilt, were like puzzle pieces beginning to fit together. Then came the pivotal suggestion, a polygraph test. Chris didn't flinch. In fact, he agreed almost too quickly, as though the offer gave him a chance to prove his innocence. The polygraph examiner, however, was more than just a technician. She was trained in observing microexpressions, speech hesitations, and physiological responses that can't be hidden by confidence alone. Before the test began, she explained the process in detail, giving Chris every opportunity to feel comfortable. But comfort never seemed to take hold. His breathing was shallow, his jaw muscles tensed when he was told the questions would be direct and specific. His hands, resting on the armrests, fidgeted slightly, fingers tapping in a slow, unconscious rhythm. During the actual test, Chris avoided using Shanann's name entirely, sticking to pronouns. When asked directly if he had physically harmed her, his voice hesitated on the first syllable before answering, "No." The polygraph recorded clear spikes, physiological reactions that would later be interpreted as signs of deception. When the test concluded, the examiner returned with the results. Sitting across from him, she leaned forward and spoke plainly. "Chris, you did not pass the polygraph." For the first time, his carefully composed expression faltered. He didn't argue, didn't protest, didn't even ask what questions had triggered the failures. Instead, he nodded slightly, eyes lowering to the table. For investigators watching from behind the glass, that reaction spoke volumes. What Chris didn't realize was that the polygraph wasn't just about the results. It was about the shift in dynamic it created. The moment he failed, the conversation moved from cooperative to confrontational, and the weight of suspicion grew heavier. The detectives were ready to change tactics, knowing the psychological pressure was beginning to break through his calm exterior. With the failed polygraph behind them, detectives shifted gears. They were no longer in the realm of polite questioning. They were in the business of confrontation. Chris was told, gently but firmly, that the evidence so far didn't match his story. They explained how trained observers could see the disconnect between his words and his body language, and how those inconsistencies painted a troubling picture. At first, Chris held his ground. He repeated his claim that Shanann had left with the children. But his voice was softer now, and his eyes rarely met those of the investigators. Each time they challenged a detail, he leaned back, folding his arms tighter, as though the physical barrier could shield him from the conversation. The detectives decided to play one of their strongest cards, invoking his own sense of family. They told him they wanted to understand what had really happened, so that Shanann and the girls could be treated with dignity. This wasn't just a tactic, it was a calculated psychological nudge, meant to push him toward confession without directly accusing him of murder. Chris's breathing changed. The steady rhythm from earlier was gone, replaced by slower inhales and sharp exhales. His hands rubbed against his thighs, a classic, self-soothing motion. He avoided the word murder, opting instead for phrases like "what happened" or "the situation," an unconscious attempt to downplay the gravity of the act. Then came the next calculated move, bringing in his father, Ronnie Watts. The detective stepped out, leaving the two men alone in the interrogation room. For a moment, the atmosphere shifted from an official investigation to a private family talk. Ronnie leaned forward, speaking softly, urging his son to be honest. "If something happened, we can work through it," he said, his voice low but steady. Chris's head dropped, his shoulders curving inward. His voice was barely audible when he finally said, "I'll tell you the truth, but you're not going to like it." The words hung in the air. He claimed he had seen Shanann hurting the girls and, in a fit of rage, reacted by killing her. It was a partial confession, a common tactic suspects use to control the narrative while offering just enough to seem cooperative. When detectives re-entered the room, they pressed for details. Chris's story was thin. The timelines didn't match the neighbor's surveillance footage, and the physical logistics of what he described didn't align with the evidence. Still, it was enough for the investigators to move forward. The shift from missing persons to homicide was now official in their minds. Meanwhile, forensic teams were mobilizing. Search warrants were secured for the Watts home, Chris's truck, and his work site. Within hours, cadaver dogs alerted to multiple spots inside the house, particularly near the master bedroom and the garage. The neighbor's security footage, once just a point of curiosity, now became a critical piece of the puzzle. It showed Chris making multiple trips between his truck and the garage in the early morning hours, activity he had not disclosed in his earlier accounts. As the search expanded, the work site became the next focus. Chris worked for an oil company, and his assigned area included remote tanks and open fields. It was there that searchers made a chilling discovery. Shanann's body was found in a shallow grave near the site. Nearby, investigators located 2 oil tanks. Inside each, they found one of the girls, Bella in one, Celeste in the other. The placement was deliberate, the method calculated to slow decomposition and make detection harder. Back at the precinct, Chris was informed of the discoveries. His reaction was muted. No outburst, no visible breakdown, just a long, silent stare at the table. For detectives, it was the final confirmation that his earlier statements had been lies from the start. The evidence was damning. Fibers from the home matched those found with the bodies. GPS data from Chris's truck placed him at the worksite during the exact window when the murders and disposal would have occurred. His cell phone records revealed a pattern of calls and messages to a woman he had been seeing romantically, a motive that prosecutors would later argue was central to the case. Chris's carefully curated image of a family man had collapsed entirely. What began as a missing persons case had, in less than 72 hours, become one of the most infamous family annihilation cases in recent history. The public, once captivated by the hope of a safe return, now watched in horror as the details emerged. The interrogation room, once a space where Chris felt in control, was now a cage. The detectives leaned in, reminding him that the truth always comes out. And with each silent minute that passed, it was clear there would be no walking back from this. Once the location of the bodies was confirmed, the case shifted into its final phase. Chris Watts, who only days earlier had stood in front of news cameras pleading for the safe return of his family, was now under arrest for their murders. But for the detectives and prosecutors, the work was far from over. Building an airtight case meant documenting every detail, from the smallest fiber to the most fleeting glance caught on video. In the weeks that followed, investigators meticulously reconstructed the timeline of the murders. Digital forensics played a crucial role. Shannan's phone, found inside the home, contained text messages, revealing a growing tension in the marriage. In the days leading up to her death, she had confided in friends about Chris's emotional distance, his sudden obsession with fitness, and her suspicion that another woman was involved. Each of these messages became a puzzle piece, aligning with what police had already observed. Then, there was Chris's phone. GPS data showed his movements with startling precision. On the morning of August 13th, his device traveled from the family home to the oil site and remained there for an extended period before returning. Combined with the neighbor's surveillance footage and his inconsistent statements, it painted a damning picture of his morning's activities. The autopsy reports added another layer of horror. Shannan had been strangled, a brutal and intimate form of killing that suggested rage and personal connection. Bella and Celeste had been smothered, their small bodies placed in separate oil tanks, a detail that chilled even seasoned investigators. The positioning of the bodies suggested an attempt to hide evidence and delay recovery, pointing directly to premeditation. Prosecutors understood the psychological weight these facts carried. They also knew that the public was following the case with intense interest. In high-profile trials, perception often influences the courtroom atmosphere. And here, the image of two young girls in oil tanks was almost too much for the public to process. Meanwhile, Chris's double life came into sharper focus. Evidence revealed that he had been in a relationship with a co-worker, Nicole Kessinger, who had no idea about the murders when they happened. Text messages between them painted the picture of a man planning for a future without his wife and children. Chris had told her he was in the process of separating from Shannan, another calculated lie meant to keep his worlds from colliding. For investigators, this relationship was critical. It provided a clear motive. Chris wanted to start fresh, free from the responsibilities of a wife and children. But instead of pursuing a legal separation or divorce, he had chosen the most violent and irreversible path. As the case moved toward trial, Chris's legal team faced the reality of the evidence stacked against him. The combination of digital data, physical forensics, and his own contradictory statements left little room for defense. In November 2018, Chris agreed to a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. He pled guilty to all charges, 5 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. The sentencing hearing was emotional and raw. Members of Shannan's family spoke directly to Chris, their voices breaking with grief and anger. Shannan's mother described her daughter's generosity and the joy she brought into every room. Her father spoke of the unbearable pain of losing not just his daughter, but his granddaughters as well. Bella and Celeste's uncle recalled their laughter and innocence, moments now frozen in memory. Chris sat motionless during these statements, his eyes fixed on the table. He offered a brief apology, but it was met with silence and visible disdain from the victim's family. The judge, after reviewing the case details, called the murders the most inhumane and vicious he had encountered in his career. He sentenced Chris Watts to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus additional years for the other charges. Even after the sentencing, questions lingered. Why had Chris chosen murder over divorce? How could a man maintain such a calm, almost pleasant demeanor in public while hiding such darkness? Psychologists weighed in, describing traits often found in family annihilators: narcissism, the desire for control, and an inability to face the perceived shame of failure. In prison, Chris became a figure of morbid fascination. Some saw him as a manipulative sociopath, others as a man who cracked under pressure. But for the families who lost Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and unborn Nico, there was no nuance, only the finality of their absence. The Chris Watts case has since been dissected in documentaries, podcasts, and true crime analysis videos. Each retelling underscores the same haunting truth: evil can wear the mask of normalcy. A man can smile for family photos, wave to neighbors, and cook dinner with his children, all while harboring thoughts that will one day shatter everything. For those who study criminal behavior, this case remains a textbook example of how small behavioral cues, inconsistencies in stories, and sudden changes in demeanor can be the first cracks in a killer's mask. And for the rest of us, it's a sobering reminder that even the most polished images can hide the darkest realities. After Chris Watts began serving his sentence, the case took an unexpected turn. In early 2019, investigators returned to interview him in prison. Their goal wasn't to retry the case. He had already confessed and been sentenced, but to fill in the gaps in the timeline and understand the precise sequence of events. What they got instead was a chilling, detailed confession that stripped away any remaining illusions about what happened on August 13, 2018. Sitting in a stark, fluorescent-lit room, wearing a prison-issued jumpsuit, Chris spoke with a calm detachment that unsettled even the seasoned agents across from him. This time, there were no deflections, no attempts to soften the truth. He admitted that the murders had not been impulsive acts of rage, but premeditated decisions carried out with calculated intent. Chris described waking up that morning knowing exactly what he was going to do. He told Shanann he no longer loved her, that he wanted a divorce. When she reacted with shock and anger, he strangled her. His account was cold, clinical, as though he were describing a mundane task. What was perhaps most disturbing was the way he described his daughter's presence. They had been alive and awake after Shanann's death, asking questions as he loaded them into the truck for the drive to the oil site. During that drive, Chris made small talk with Bella and Celeste. They had no idea their father's plan was to kill them. At the site, he smothered Celeste first, then Bella, an order he admitted to choosing without any clear reason. Bella's final words, "Daddy, no," would haunt investigators and anyone who heard them. Chris recounted these details without visible emotion, a fact that spoke volumes about his state of mind. This new confession destroyed his earlier claims that Shanann had harmed the children. It revealed that his first partial confession was just another manipulation, an attempt to control the narrative even as it collapsed around him. Now, stripped of that control, he seemed almost relieved to lay out the truth in full. For behavioral analysts, this second confession was a goldmine of insight into the psychology of a family annihilator. It showed a man capable of compartmentalizing extreme violence, of performing normal social behavior while internally justifying the most heinous acts. It also confirmed what many had suspected, that the motive was not just about a new relationship, but about reshaping his life entirely, erasing the parts he no longer wanted. In the months following the interview, documentaries and investigative specials began incorporating these new details. The story became even darker, not because of the sensationalism, but because of the banality of Chris's demeanor. He wasn't the stereotypical killer fueled by uncontrollable rage. He was a man who made a plan, executed it, and walked through the aftermath as though he could still talk his way out of it. Shanann's family, already devastated, faced the renewed pain of hearing the full account. They spoke publicly about the need to remember Shanann and the children not for how they died, but for how they lived. Friends and supporters organized memorials, fundraisers, and awareness campaigns for domestic violence prevention. Their message was clear: the warning signs in relationships, emotional withdrawal, sudden lifestyle changes, secrecy, should never be ignored. For the true crime community, the Chris Watts case remains one of the most unsettling examples of hidden darkness. The sheer contrast between his outward image and his private reality forces uncomfortable questions. How well can we ever really know someone? How many perfect lives on social media are hiding fractures beneath the surface? And how can we as a society better detect the warning signs before tragedy strikes? Even in prison, Chris continues to draw letters and attention from strangers, some of whom express sympathy or even romantic interest. This phenomenon, known as hybristophilia, is not uncommon in high-profile criminal cases, but it underscores the complexity of public perception when crime and image collide. In the end, Chris Watts will spend the rest of his life behind bars, his only freedom the daily routine of a maximum security facility. The walls around him are a permanent reminder of the life he destroyed and the lives he chose to end. For investigators, the case is closed. For Shanann's family, the grief will never truly end. And for the rest of us, the story of Chris Watts is a permanent reminder of how the face we show the world can be a mask, and how sometimes that mask hides something unthinkable. If you found this case breakdown insightful, remember, every week we explore the psychology behind real criminal cases, where body language, microexpressions, and subtle cues reveal the truth before the words ever do. Subscribe to Deep Crime Files and join us as we uncover the hidden tells in the world's most infamous investigations.